And I think I've been listening very carefully to the debate over the past period, both tonight and indeed particularly before Christmas. And I have to say I'm a bit concerned about some of the comments around it and some of the tone and attitudes being displayed towards people who raise concerns about this legislation. And it's becoming an increasingly common feature of our society that people who maybe raise concerns and ask for more reasoned dialogue are vilified as some sort of outliers, pariahs, filibusterers, responsible for killing people on our roads or whatever. And I just don't think that that's helpful. I don't believe anybody in here is in favour of making the roads unsafer, is in favour of jeopardising anybody's life. Of course we're not. I mean, I understand and fully support the desire and efforts to make our roads safer. I genuinely believe that everybody does. I also agree, and I accept the point, that even one death on the road is one death too many. But that doesn't mean that making that point that I haven't got the right to raise concerns about this legislation or question its effectiveness, which I do. And I don't think this tone is helpful, and it's something that we as a society have to look at. I mean, if you raise issues about, say, for example, you're against criminalising the purchase of sex, suddenly that means you're in favour of exploiting women. If you support the call to end the sanctions on Syria, somehow that makes you a supporter of Bashar al-Assad. And if you raise questions about this legislation, when you're irresponsible, you're a gombeen and a pariah and you're jeopardising people's lives. And that's not on. I don't think that that's healthy, and I don't think it's a good way of debating issues, and I think we should be more adult about it, as it were. And I've listened to a lot of the debate, and I actually don't know, and I still don't know what I think about it, to be honest. But I do think some very valid points have been raised with regard to questioning its effectiveness at all, and certainly its effectiveness in the context of other major issues where road safety and lives are being put at risk. So I just want to maybe deal with some of those points. I mean, Deputy O'Brien made the points that we know that this legislation will save some lives. Well, I actually don't know that that's the case, and I haven't seen the evidence in that regard, because what we're talking about is increasing the punishment at the lower level of alcohol consumption. How do we know that that's going to save lives? It may not. It's very, very doubt. That's what we're doing here, and to me, it's not hugely effective. I mean, essentially, when you cut back, I suppose, the padding, essentially what's been done here is to create a new category of disqualification for drink driving. That's it in a nutshell, against the backdrop of huge other issues which need to be addressed. At present, if an experienced driver has more than 80 milligrams but less than 100 in their blood, then they'll be disqualified for 6 months under the administrative system. If they go to court for the offence, they'll face a year's disqualification, whereas an experienced driver with more than 100 milligrams but less than 150 of alcohol in their blood who goes to court will face a 2-year ban. So that's there. So what this bill does is create a new category for disqualification at the lower level of blood alcohol, namely an experienced driver with between 50 and 80 milligrams of alcohol in their blood will be disqualified for 3 months under the administrative process, as against the present penalty of 3 penalty points. And I have to say I am in two minds, and I have listened to the debate, and I was particularly struck, I think, by the contribution of Deputy Eamon O'Queeve and the points he made around the issues of proportionality, which I thought were actually very important, because he made the point that this bill, if enacted, will have a hugely disproportionate effect on those living in Ireland without any access to public transport. The tens of thousands of people who have been left to rely on themselves and their cars because generations of abysmal spatial planning, of us turning a blind eye to one-off houses all over the place, and our consistent failure to invest in public transport. Now, if somebody in rural Ireland falls foul of this legislation and ends up losing their licence for 3 months, they'll have to get taxis to work, if there's taxis even in the areas that they live in. If their children have to be brought to school, they're going to have to get taxis to bring their children to school, depending on the parents' work patterns. Against the backdrop where the government has cut back on school transport services viciously, actually, over the past number of years, sometimes as something that actually affects people in rural areas in my own constituency and in general, and an issue which I'm actually frequently contacted about. So if somebody can't drive and there's nothing there from the state to pick up the slack, well then, and help them get their kids to school, for me that is a problem. And on the other hand, say a person in Dublin runs up against the legislation and is disqualified, well, they can get the bus or the train or the Luas for 3 months. It's not the end of the world. And, you know, while it obviously is a slight inconvenience, it's not really actually a big deal at all for those people. And to me, that is incredibly unfair. There's a basis to why deputies are raising a concern about this, because if there is to be a sanction, then it should apply to all equally, and not penalise some groups more than others. And the impact of such a penalty, because of all the other issues, means that actually we're disproportionately impacting one group of people rather than others. In some ways, it's a little bit like the argument in terms of linking fines to income. I mean, €120 clamp removal fee is nothing to somebody who's earning €100,000, but it's a hell of a lot to somebody who's on the minimum wage. So by not linking fines to income, we effectively set up a situation where there's one law for the poor and one for the rich. And the poor are actually forced to abide by the law, while the rich can do what they like and soak up the sanction. And I think it's a little bit like that with this bill, because we are creating a heavy sanction for people in rural areas and a lighter one for people in the cities. That's just a point of fact. It's not right, but it's a consequence of other government policies. Now, you could say, well, sure, all they have to do is not have a drink. Don't have a drink at all. Well, then we should be outlawing use of alcohol at all levels then. Why are you having a discriminatory impact if you're saying that there shouldn't be different categories, if you're going to disqualify anybody for even a small level of alcohol? The reason why there's different levels there is that there are differences, and I think most adults accept that there is a difference. There is a difference between somebody maybe who goes out once a week to collect their pension in a rural area, has a pint, drives home on the same rural road that he always drives on all the time or whatever. It's part of way of overcoming isolation and so on. There's a big difference between that person who's maybe had a pint or two all their lives and people who go out and have 10 pints and get behind the car when they can't even put the key in a thing. That's why we have different categories in the first place, to recognise that situation. And it is going to have a very, very serious impact, I think. And there is an irony in this, or a hypocrisy, I suppose, when actually the statistics tell us that if we want to deal with road deaths and appalling tragedies, and I fully accept that we all do, we'll start with the main things that cause that. And speeding is a much bigger cause or killer than drink driving is, particularly in this era where actually young people are much better educated now about the negative impact of drunk driving. Actually, fewer young people drink drive now than they did maybe in the years when I was growing up, or other deputies, where it is frowned upon by society that would happen. So already we've created a climate where most people accept that it's unacceptable to drive while drunk. It's absolutely frowned upon. I don't think we've got to the same place in terms of speeding, but speeding actually has a much bigger impact. And a lot of the young men or whatever who love their cars, they don't drink because they're saving their money to spend it on the car, but they're going out speeding. And we need to educate people in terms of that. I think there should be mandatory classes in all schools in terms of road safety, in terms of how to use cars and so on. Mobile phones as well. I think it could be scientifically shown in the cases of most people, regardless of their physiological composition and so on, that actually driving with a mobile phone, or trying to use a mobile phone which necessitates you taking your eye off the road, is far more dangerous than somebody driving with one drink. And there's a recognition, I believe, in our legislation now that accepts that point because of the different gradings. And I want to again come back to the point, and I think it's terrible that we have to, but no doubt when you raise any questions, your viewpoint is going to be distorted and somehow portrayed as condoning drunk driving. But it's to come back to the point that we're talking about changing the penalty at the low level of alcohol in that. And what we should be doing really is dealing with deterrent. How do we deter people? Not how do we punish people. I don't actually accept that a punishment of this character is necessarily a deterrent at all, and I haven't seen the evidence that would support that view. But I think one of the things that struck me as really ironic is that we've so little time in here and, I suppose, resources to move legislation, to put all emphasis on this as some sort of a catch-all. I just don't see it, and I think we have to make the points about the rules that we have already in place. And there is a bitter irony that we're having this discussion and putting this forward as a solution to the problems on our road when we know what has happened in this state over the past period. And I'm talking about, obviously, the 2 million phantom breath tests, the widespread practice of phantom MAT checkpoints. So it wasn't just about the breath test. So we have this legislation which then the Gardaí somehow conflate, mismanage, misrepresent and fraudulently return figures to say that they've done the checkpoints when they haven't done so. Why did that happen? Well, it happened in part because of the reduction in Garda numbers, and the Garda Traffic Corps numbers have been depleted over the past period and still are by comparison to what they should be. If we really want to talk about safety on our roads, it'll be far more, and I'm talking about drunk drivers as well. You'll do it not by changing a piece of legislation, but by having real checkpoints out there that implement real breath tests for people who try and break the law. That would have a far greater impact and act as a deterrent than any piece of paper that's here now. And I'm really at a loss for why we haven't considered that and elevated and pushed that forward. And it's not just an issue for rural Ireland, even though there's an important impact there, because there are parts of Dublin and other cities that have actually a chronic dearth of public transport. My own constituency in particular, I would be remiss not to mention it here. Swords is incredibly poorly served by public transport, a population of over 45,000, bigger than Drogheda. In other words, relying on a private bus service and a Dublin bus service that is nowhere near anywhere delivering to our population. While we hear a lot of talk about Metro North, it's been going on for years and years, but nothing has happened. And to live in Fingal without a car, you'd find it very, very difficult to get around. And I think given the size of the population, that is genuinely mind-boggling. So people in both rural and in urban areas, as far as I'm concerned, deserve the choice of getting public transport where they want to go. And instead of moving with the times and increasing public transport provision, we're facing massive fines, actually, for missing our emissions targets. The government is instead coming up with harebrained bus routes being put out to tender by private companies, something that the dogs in the streets will tell you is not going to leave these areas properly serviced and will actually force more people back into their cars. So it's a vicious circle. So, I mean, I made the point at the start, and I'll reiterate it again. I am in two minds about this bill. I don't know how I view it. I know for sure it's not the solution to the problems on our roads. I'm highly sceptical that it would make a fraction of difference. I'd have to say, I know Deputy O'Brien said it might save one life. I'm not sure that it will, to be honest, because I think we're talking about the lower level of alcohol. If we were really serious, we'd deal with other aspects, and we're talking about it against the backdrop of where there's no enforcement. And if there's no enforcement, you can come up with the most vicious, penalising policy that you like, but if everybody knows it's not going to be enforced, well, then it's not going to make a blind bit of difference anyway. And again, I want to come back to the point that was made so well by Deputy O'Keefe, that it's hard to see a bill that, I suppose, punishes disproportionately people who are already suffering the effects of terrible government policy in terms of lack of investment in public transport, but also the gutting of many of our rural areas and all of the social problems and mental health problems and other issues that go with back. On the argument of proportionality, I think this is a poor piece of legislation, and I do want to say we all want to put an end to drink driving deaths on our roads. Of course we do, but I haven't heard enough arguments to tell me that this is the best or the fairest way to achieve that goal. And I don't think it takes an overview enough of modern Irish society, whereby the increasing use actually of drug use is prevalent to such an extent and not being factored in. So, as far as I'm concerned, I think if we were really serious about these issues, we'd be dealing with it from a planning point of view, we'd be dealing with it from a public transport point of view, from an investment in our roads, from our education system to provide a deterrent and a raising of awareness, but critically from the issue of enforcement of the legislation that is already there. So I'm open and looking forward to hearing the rest of the debate, because, hand on heart, I actually don't know what way I feel about it at the moment.